Imagine, picture this. You're a young boy, you're in Missouri, it's a civil war.
Oh, wow.
And one day, Confederate raiders, they storm your town, threatening your family and ransacking your father's store.
That's
Yeah,
intense.
it's a pretty terrifying scene.
Yeah.
And this terrifying experience would shape the life of a man who'd later become a legend,
Yeah.
General John J. Blackjack Pershing.
Wow, what a story. I mean, that's quite the start.
It really is. And you've shared some fascinating excerpts with us from the History That Doesn't Suck podcast. And so today,
Yeah.
we are taking a deep dive into Pershing's life and career.
Awesome. I'm excited to dig into this. This is fascinating already.
Yeah, me too. And it's incredible to consider, how such a traumatic event witnessed at such a young age might have molded his character and how it influenced his approach to leadership later on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to see something like that so young, it's got to have a lasting impact for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're going to follow his path from that tumultuous childhood all the way to the eve of America's entry into World War I, and we're going to unpack the moments that forged this extraordinary leader.
Sounds good. I'm ready.
All right, so let's start with that Civil War raid in 1864. The podcast describes a 4-year-old Pershing hiding absolutely terrified as these bushwhackers terrorized his town. It's a stark reminder that these historical figures we study were once children too, experiencing the world in all its complexity.
Yeah, that's something we often forget, like these larger than life figures, they started out just like the rest of us.
Right, exactly. And these early experiences can have a profound impact. And in Pershing's case, this event, it likely contributed to his strong sense of justice and discipline. He learned firsthand the devastating consequences of conflict and the importance of order in the face of chaos.
Makes sense. I can see how that would shape someone's worldview.
The podcast even quotes Pershing, recalling that he was badly scared during the raid. It's a chilling image, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It makes you wonder how such a young boy coped with that level of fear and uncertainty.
Well, I think it speaks to his resilience, even at that early age. Not everyone could come out of something like that and thrive.
Right, and it's interesting to consider how this experience might have contrasted with his later years at West Point, where order and discipline were paramount.
Oh, that's a good point. It's like almost a training ground for the real thing in a way.
Yeah, like those formative years prepared him for the rigors of military life. Speaking of West Point, Pershing excelled there, didn't he? He graduated top of his class, served as senior cadet captain, and chose to join the cavalry.
He did. He was a high achiever from the start. It seems like his ambition and leadership qualities were evident even then, and West Point further honed his discipline and provided a foundation for his future military career.
And that career was anything but ordinary. After West Point, he was thrust into the thick of it, fighting in the Indian Wars against the Apache and Sioux.
Right into the action.
Wow. Yeah, and what's fascinating about this period is that despite the inherent conflict, Pershing developed a grudging respect for the indigenous people he fought against. He saw their resilience, their strategic brilliance, and their deep connection to the land. This exposure likely shaped his perspective on warfare, pushing him to seek understanding and diplomacy whenever possible.
It's interesting how experiencing conflict firsthand can sometimes live to a deeper understanding and respect for your opponent.
Yeah, it's a reminder that even amidst conflict, there's room for empathy and respect.
For sure.
The podcast highlights a story where Pershing, while commanding the Buffalo Soldiers of the 10th Cavalry, successfully negotiated the peaceful deportation of Cree refugees seeking asylum in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
This not only demonstrated his diplomatic skills, but also his commitment to treating all people fairly, regardless of their background.
That's a great example of his leadership and his sense of justice.
And this seems like a recurring theme in his career. A strong sense of justice and fairness, regardless of race or background. And those values were certainly tested during his time in the Philippines, where he played a key role in pacifying the Moro uprisings.
Right, the Philippines. That was a complex and often brutal conflict, wasn't it?
It was, and Pershing found himself right in the middle of it. But rather than resorting solely to force, he prioritized understanding the local culture and language. He studied Islam, immersed himself in the Moro way of life, and even learned to speak their dialects.
That's remarkable. That takes a lot of dedication and a willingness to see things from a different perspective.
This approach, while not always successful, demonstrated his belief in finding common ground and seeking peaceful solutions whenever possible.
I mean, it's a shame that approach isn't always embraced even today. It shows a real forward-thinking mindset.
It sounds like he was ahead of his time in recognizing the importance of cultural understanding in conflict resolution.
He really does seem that way.
And speaking of different link, his whirlwind romance and marriage to Frances Warren, daughter of a powerful senator, certainly raised eyebrows.
Oh, tell me about this.
They met during his time teaching military science at the University of Nebraska,
Okay.
and President Theodore Roosevelt himself attended their wedding.
Wow, that's
Oh,
quite the endorsement.
it was quite the society event. This marriage thrust Pershing into the national spotlight and fueled his rapid ascent through the military ranks. However, it also sparked controversy with accusations of favoritism due to his powerful father-in-law.
Ah, so that's where the rumors started.
The podcast even mentions rumors of a Filipina mistress. Well, these were later disproven. It seems like Pershing's personal life became intertwined with his professional life, for better or worse.
Yeah, that happens sometimes, especially when you're in the public eye like that.
And his rapid promotion to brigadier general in 1906, skipping several ranks, raised eyebrows and fueled those rumors. It's a reminder that even amidst achievements, public perception and scrutiny can play a significant role in shaping a leader's image.
Absolutely. Perception is everything, especially in positions of power.
And that image would be further tested during his leadership of the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico. This was a challenging campaign logistically and strategically, but it provided Pershing with invaluable experience in managing large-scale military operations.
So the Mexican Revolution and the pursuit of Pancho Villa really served as a testing ground for his leadership skills.
Exactly. He learned to adapt to difficult terrain, coordinate complex maneuvers, and manage a diverse force of soldiers. These experiences would prove crucial in the years to come as Europe descended into the chaos of World War I.
So this is all setting the stage for the main event, so to speak.
Exactly.
I'm hooked. I gotta know what happens next.
We'll have to stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive to find out.
As we kind of dig deeper into Pershing's story, it's really striking how these experiences in the American West and in Mexico kind of foreshadowed this monumental task that he'd soon face, preparing the United States for entry into World War I.
It's 1917, and the U.S. finds itself on the brink of joining a conflict that has already, reshaped the global landscape. Yet the American military is woefully unprepared for the scale and intensity of this new kind of war.
You're right about that. The U.S. Army at the time was ranked a dismal 17th in the world.
Wow.
Smaller than Serbia's, even.
That's hard to believe.
They had a strong navy, yes, but their ground forces were ill-equipped and they lacked experience in large-scale modern warfare.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling to think about that now, given America's current military power. So what were the specific challenges that Pershing faced in transforming this relatively small and outdated force into a fighting force capable of taking on the might of the German Empire?
Well, first and foremost, manpower.
Right.
The U.S. needed to raise an army quickly, and that meant implementing the draft, which was a controversial move,
Yeah.
considering the Civil War draft riots were still pretty fresh in people's memories.
Oh, absolutely. It must have been a delicate balancing act, ensuring fairness and inclusivity in the draft process, while also mobilizing millions of men as swiftly as possible. Can you imagine the logistical nightmare? Registering 10 million men, setting up training camps, equipping them, feeding them, it's just mind-boggling.
Absolutely. And all of this while grappling with limited resources and a tight budget, Congress had to scramble to raise funds through war bonds and income tax hikes. They even had to resort to measures like the Espionage Act, which curtailed free speech in the name of national security.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this period of intense mobilization really fundamentally altered the relationship between the government and its citizens. The federal government took on a much larger role, from managing railroads to regulating food supplies, a shift that would have lasting consequences.
You're right. You bring up a crucial point. While these wartime measures were deemed necessary at the time, they also sparked debates about civil liberties and the potential for government overreach concerns that resonate even today.
And amidst all this internal upheaval, Pershing also faced immense pressure from the Allies, particularly the British and the French. They were desperate for American troops to bolster their depleted ranks and pushed for amalgamation, essentially absorbing American units into their own armies.
That's right. They saw American troops as a quick fix, a way to just plug the gaps in their own lines.
Right.
But Pershing fiercely resisted this idea. He believed that American soldiers would fight best under their own flag and their own leadership.
And it's understandable why he pushed back against that. It was about preserving American autonomy, ensuring that their contribution to the war effort wasn't simply relegated to being cannon fodder for other nations' battles.
Precisely. He saw amalgamation as a threat to his vision of building a strong, independent American army. And this clash of priorities came to a head at a tense meeting of the Supreme War Council in Abbeville, France in May of 1918.
So imagine the scene, Pershing, surrounded by Allied leaders, facing intense pressure to relinquish control of his troops. What happened?
Well, he stood firm.
Good for him.
He made it clear that the United States was committed to the Allied cause, but would fight as an independent force under American leadership. He actually said, "Gentlemen, I have thought this program over very deliberately and will not be coerced." And then he walked out of the meeting.
Wow, what a powerful statement. That must have sent shockwaves through the Allied leadership.
It did. It signaled that the U.S. was not simply a junior partner in this alliance.
Right.
It marked a pivotal moment in establishing American military independence on the world stage.
But it wasn't a complete stalemate, was it? He did eventually agree to deploy some American divisions under French command, at least temporarily.
Yeah, he understood the urgency of the situation, particularly after Russia's exit from the war, freed up a massive number of German troops for the Western Front. The German Spring Offensive of 1918 was brutal, pushing the Allies back and threatening to break through their lines.
So Pershing had to balance his long-term vision with the immediate needs of the war effort. It was a high-stakes game of strategy and compromise.
Absolutely. And while he allowed for some temporary deployments under French command, his ultimate goal remained unchanged: to build a capable and independent American fighting force. The challenges were immense, though.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the logistical nightmares of raising a massive army practically overnight. Can you give us a sense of what those challenges look like on the ground?
Well, for starters, there were chronic shortages of everything, from rifles to boots. Training was often rushed and inadequate, and communication was a major obstacle, with recruits speaking dozens of different languages.
The podcast actually mentions a striking image: American soldiers drilling with broomsticks because they didn't have enough rifles.
Really?
It's a stark reminder of the resourcefulness and determination required in those early days. Can you imagine preparing for the most brutal war in history by marching around with broomsticks?
It's almost absurd, yet it speaks volumes about the commitment of those young men. And beyond the logistical hurdles, there was this immense cultural clash. Imagine being a young man from rural America suddenly thrust into the trenches of Europe, facing a foreign language, unfamiliar customs, and a way of life vastly different from anything you've ever known.
It must have been a sensory overload, both terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. And then there's the enemy they were facing, the German army, highly trained, well-equipped, and utterly ruthless.
The German army was a formidable opponent, and the fighting in World War I was brutal beyond anything previously seen. The trenches were a living hell, muddy, rat-infested, and constantly under threat of artillery bombardment and gas attacks. It was a dehumanizing experience, a far cry from the romanticized notions of warfare that many young men brought with them.
It's difficult to even fathom the psychological toll that kind of fighting must have taken on these soldiers. They were witnessing death and destruction on an unprecedented scale, and yet they persevered.
They did. Driven by a sense of duty, patriotism, and camaraderie, they fought with incredible courage and determination. And amid this chaos and carnage, Pershing never lost sight of his vision for an independent American army.
It sounds like he was constantly walking a tightrope, trying to balance the immediate needs of the war effort with his long-term goals for the American military. Did his persistence pay off?
It did, though, not without sacrifices. Pershing's leadership would eventually help turn the tide of the war, but the cost of victory was immense. To understand the full impact of his decisions, we need to delve into the pivotal battles that shaped the final year of the war.
We left off with Pershing facing this almost impossible task, leading this rapidly assembled army against a formidable enemy in a war unlike any the world had ever seen. It's 1918, and the outcome of the Great War hangs in the balance. What were some of the key moments that truly tested Pershing's leadership during this pivotal year?
Well, the German Spring Offensive was a major turning point. The Allies were reeling, and the pressure on Pershing to commit American troops to the front lines intensified. But he held firm. He knew that rushing unprepared soldiers into battle would be disastrous.
He was caught between a rock and a hard place, wasn't he? On the one hand, he had the Allies desperate for reinforcements. On the other hand, he was committed to ensuring that American soldiers were adequately trained and equipped before being sent into the meat grinder of the trenches.
Exactly. It was a delicate balancing act. And it all came to a head during the Second Battle of the Marne in July of 1918. The Germans were making a final push to capture Paris, and the situation was desperate.
So what did Pershing do? Did he finally cave to the Allied pressure?
He made a calculated decision, a strategic compromise. He met with French General Ferdinand Foch, the supreme Allied commander, and offered to place several American divisions under Foch's command for the duration of the emergency.
It was a significant concession, wasn't it? A temporary departure from his staunch insistence on American independence on the battlefield.
It was. But Pershing recognized the gravity of the situation. He was willing to put aside his personal ambitions for the greater good of the Allied cause.
And did this decision pay off?
It did. The American troops fighting alongside the French played a crucial role in repelling the German offensive. Their bravery and their fighting spirit helped to blunt the German advance and turn the tide of the battle.
It sounds like the Second Battle of the Marne was a real turning point in the war. Was this the moment when the Allies finally gained the upper hand?
Yes, you could say that the German advance was halted. Their momentum was broken. From that point on, the initiative shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, and the American Expeditionary Force, now battle-hardened and confident, would play an increasingly important role in driving the Germans back.
And through it all, Pershing ensured that American troops fought as a cohesive unit under American leadership, right?
He did. Even though he had agreed to temporarily place some divisions under French command, he maintained overall control of the AEF. They weren't just reinforcements for other armies, they were a distinct fighting force operating under their own flag and their own commanders.
It sounds like Pershing's vision for an independent American army was finally coming to fruition. Were there any particular battles or campaigns that really showcased the AES capabilities?
Absolutely. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which launched in September of 1918, was a major test for the AEF. It was a massive operation involving over 1 million American troops, and it aimed to break through the German lines and liberate key territory.
This must have been one of the largest and most complex military operations in American history up to that point.
It was, and the fighting was incredibly intense, some of the most brutal of the entire war. But the American troops, now seasoned and experienced, fought with incredible courage and determination. They pushed the Germans back inch by bloody inch, overcoming heavy resistance and suffering significant casualties.
It's hard to imagine the sheer scale of that battle, the chaos and carnage, the bravery and sacrifice.
It was a testament to the transformation that Pershing had overseen. He had taken a small, ill-equipped army and forged it into a powerful fighting force capable of taking on the best that Germany had to offer.
And ultimately, did the Meuse-Argonne Offensive contribute to the end of the war?
It played a decisive role. It crippled the German army, shattered their morale, and forced them to the negotiating table. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed, bringing an end to the hostilities.
It was a hard-won victory, a victory that came at a tremendous cost. Over 116,000 American soldiers lost their lives in World War I.
It's a sobering reminder of the human cost of conflict. Those sacrifices should never be forgotten.
So looking back on Pershing's leadership during World War I, what are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think his story highlights the importance of vision, determination, and resilience in the face of adversity. He faced immense challenges building an army from scratch, navigating complex political pressures, and leading troops in a brutal and unfamiliar type of warfare.
He certainly had his work cut out for him.
He did, but he never wavered in his belief that the United States could and should play a decisive role in the war. And he fought tirelessly to ensure that American soldiers were well-trained, well-led, and given the opportunity to prove themselves on the battlefield.
His insistence on an independent American army also had a profound impact on the country's military future, didn't it?
Absolutely. It set a precedent for American military involvement in future conflicts, establishing the expectation that the U.S. would operate as a major power leading its own forces, rather than simply being absorbed into other nations' armies.
So Pershing's legacy extends far beyond World War I. He helped to shape the American military into the force it is today.
He did. And his story offers valuable lessons about leadership strategy and the complexities of war. It's a reminder that even amidst the chaos and brutality of conflict, individuals can make a difference, and their choices can have far-reaching consequences.
So this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the life and career of General John J. Blackjack Pershing. Thank you for guiding us through this fascinating journey.
My pleasure. It's always a privilege to share these stories of courage and leadership.
And for those of you listening, if you're interested in learning more about Pershing and the complexities of World War I highly recommend checking out the History That Doesn't Suck podcast. It's a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to delve deeper into this pivotal period in history.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those questions coming.